We're going to continue our Second World War quick study with the first 3 years of the Second World War, spanning from 1939 to 1941. Now, we want to start with an understanding of the strategies that are being deployed by the belligerents in the Second World War, beginning with the German Blitzkrieg strategy. This is Adolf Hitler and his military strategy of lightning warfare designed to avoid fighting that war of attrition. It's Hitler's memory that Germany lost World War I when it devolved into a war of attrition, and they don't want to get into the trenches again. It relies on improvements in air power and mobile infantry in order to quickly defeat an enemy before anybody can get dug in. While at the same time, the French are building fortifications like this, called the Maginot Line, which is essentially just an elaborate trench warfare because they won the last war. They won the war of attrition, and they want to do it again. Blitzkrieg will first be used with Germany's invasion of Poland on September 1st, 1939. Now, the Poles have a vast frontier to defend, and they were ill-equipped against the German Blitzkrieg attack. Germany's army, Germany's military, Germany's air force is all top of the line, brand new, because it literally just got rebuilt. And the Poles are left on their own with no support from Britain and France outside of an actual declaration of war. Britain and France did follow through with a declaration of war against Germany. However, they weren't able to do anything about what was happening in Poland, as France did not want to march beyond their Maginot Line into Germany, leaving their fortifications behind them. And it would be dangerous to fly over Germany to try to offer air support to the Poles. So though they declare war, Britain and France are really sitting on the side. And this is what becomes known as the phony war, or as some derided it, the Blitzkrieg warfare from the West. Western allies never launched an invasion of Germany in the West in these early months of the war. Britain and France were still mobilizing for a wider war. The British Expeditionary Force did go to France in order to support them and protect against an invasion. But the French felt that they were protected by their Maginot Line, and there was no need to march beyond that. So this is a very different war from the First World War, where there was nearly constant battles on the Eastern Front and the Western Front. World War II sees the Western Front slowly developing as the Allies do not want to march beyond their border defenses. In April of 1940, Germany will begin to push to the west with an invasion of Denmark and Norway. There's a desire for Scandinavian iron resources, and they want to make any attempts at a blockade, like we saw in World War I, more difficult. Sweden is going to allow Germany to use its rail line so it can connect to its conquered territory in Norway. Now, following the fall of Norway, Neville Chamberlain will resign. It is clear that his appeasement policy did not work, and now there is a wider war. And Winston Churchill becomes the new prime minister. Germany will quickly move into the Low Countries and invade France by May of 1940. Like World War I, Germany will avoid the border with France by going around the Maginot Line through Belgium. Now, the French will offer a tremendous resistance, and they will fight hard and suffer terribly. Over 100,000 soldiers lost in 6 weeks prior to their surrender. Another 2 million soldiers were taken prisoner. So this is not an instance where the French immediately surrendered to the Germans. They suffered incredible losses before that surrender came. An escape at Dunkirk, at the port city of Dunkirk, saw 380,000 British and French troops be evacuated from Dunkirk to Britain, able to survive another day. And those soldiers will eventually be coming back to the continent with the D-Day invasions. This leaves Britain largely alone in Europe in 1940 and 41. The leadership of Winston Churchill, giving radio speeches and trying to keep the British public in line here. In July to October of 1940, the Germans will launch what is called the Battle of Britain, which is their attempt to gain air superiority over southern England so they can launch their invasion known as Operation Sea Lion, their planned invasion of the British Isles. The Luftwaffe would bomb British towns in what was known as the Blitz in order to try to push the British surrender. But this isn't a true Blitzkrieg warfare because there's no tanks on the ground. There's no infantry on the ground pushing in because it's an island and it's much harder to do that. Britain never did surrender. Germany ultimately abandoned their invasion plans as the Royal Air Force was victorious in the Battle of Britain. Now, the United States is a neutral power in the early months of this war. However, American assistance is getting pushed into the Allies. September of 1940, the American Congress agrees to a destroyers for bases and ultimately traded American naval destroyers to Britain for leasing rights on British possessions. And in March of 1941, the United States pushes even further with the passage of the Lend-Lease Act, which would open up more military and financial aid to Britain and other allies. In August of 1941, Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt will agree to the Atlantic Charter, which will outline the goals for this war. This is Churchill's attempt to get the United States into a war. And importantly, this war, says Churchill, will not be about territorial gains. It will support ideas of self-determination and support notions of free trade. And this is all kind of the opposite of what came out of the First World War. This is Franklin Roosevelt recognizing that the American people are not supportive of another war just to strengthen the British Empire. Now, after the defeat in the Battle of Britain, Adolf Hitler is going to call for the invasion of the Soviet Union in June of 1941, launching nearly 4 million German soldiers across his border into Soviet lands. This is the largest land invasion in world history. Adolf Hitler sees this as the right time due to how weak the Soviet Union was following their disastrous winter war with Finland. What becomes known as Operation Barbarossa, it features a three-pronged attack into the Soviet Union, focusing on St. Petersburg or Leningrad in the north, Moscow with a central push, and then a move through southern Soviet Union to the oil-rich Caucasus region. And that's that push onto Stalingrad that you see here on the map. Hitler is confident that his Western Front was secure. He didn't defeat Britain, didn't conquer Britain, but they were still on the island, so they couldn't do anything about the Western Front. And this invasion of the Soviet Union would offer Lebensraum, all of that land. It would bring an end to communism, he thought, and it would be valuable supplies of resources. Now, early in this invasion, the Germans were very successful. Stalin was unprepared, thought he could rest on his Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact. But very quickly, we're going to see the Soviet Union with its unprecedented resources be able to withstand this German push despite incredibly heavy losses. Ultimately, the invasion of the Soviet Union proves to be a failure. German armies were stretched too thin with their three-pronged attack. This is just too vast for Blitzkrieg warfare. The invasion was so successful in places that armies often outpaced their supplies. The Soviet Union was, as I said, too large for Blitzkrieg strategies, and the Russian winter will start to bog down and ultimately freeze the ill-equipped German soldiers. Soviet resources allowed for new factories to be constructed to the east of Moscow, so new tanks and planes can continually be thrown into the mix. And the Soviet resistance ended up being very successful. Soviets used a scorched earth policy where they retreated and destroyed anything that the Germans might be able to use, which ended up bogging down the German advance. And guerrilla attacks in the Soviet Union would strike at German supply and communication points and be very successful. From August of 1942 into February of 1943, the Battle of Stalingrad turns out to be a major turning point in this Eastern War. Germans will lose over 800,000 men as Hitler refuses to let his armies surrender when they're trapped in the city. This city, Stalingrad, had such important significance based on its name for both Joseph Stalin to hold on to and for Adolf Hitler to conquer. And this is going to be the extent of the push of Soviet armies into the Soviet Union, or German armies into the Soviet Union. Now, while all this is happening, we've also got a story developing in the Pacific. Following months of economic sanctions, as Japan had pushed into Southeast Asia, Japan began to plan for an attack at Pearl Harbor on the United States naval base in Hawaii. On December 7th, 1941, Japan launched that attack, along with simultaneous attacks on Hong Kong and British Singapore and Malaya, American holdings in Guam and Midway and the Philippines. The impact of this, the United States Pacific Fleet was badly damaged, but aircraft carriers were out to sea and the narrow channel at Pearl Harbor was still open. The Japanese had hoped to close it off so ships couldn't get in or out, but it was still open. And this led the United States and the British to declare war on Japan on December 8th, 1941. Following that, the Germans will stick with their tripartite pact and declare war on the United States. So by January of 1942, we have Operation Barbarossa being the first major failure of Blitzkrieg warfare for the Germans. The Grand Alliance of the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, and the United States has now been formed. Germany is facing a two-front war, and Japan failed to meet their goals on those December 7th attacks, and we're now at a war with the United States. And we'll see you next time to wrap up the Second World War.